Doug Bandow is former special assistant to President Reagan, and he's been affiliated with several free market organizations, libertarian and conservative, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, Competitive Enterprise Institute. He is presently the Robert A. Taft Fellow at the American Conservative Defense Alliance. He's the author of several books, including Foreign Follies, America's New Global Empire, which will have copies out there for sale. And the title of his talk is Saving the Republic, Resisting the Imperial Temptation. Doug Bandow.
Well, thank you all very much. It's a great honor to be here, especially in such a stellar lineup of people. I mean, you look at the speakers, there are people of mine who have been heroes of mine, somebody like a Daniel Ellsberg, who I'd only read about. And to actually see the person and hear him was a wonderful opportunity. And longtime friends of mine, Ted Galen Carpenter, Ralph Raico, and others. It's truly an exceptional panel that Bumper has put together. And it's a lineup that should be heard not just by hundreds of people, they should be heard by thousands or millions of people. The message, I think, out of this conference is absolutely critical. Now, there's also a certain personal pleasure. I was kind of the understudy, I joked. Bumper had asked me to be a backup if anybody, couldn't speak. And at dinner last night, I mentioned that I was getting kind of desperate as we got closer to the Monday morning end of the session, that I was thinking of the Tonya Harding solution. That maybe one of the other speakers needed to have, an unfortunate accident. And I noticed that Ted Galen Carpenter moved his chair perceptibly away from me at that moment. Ted, who I might know, you might want to talk to him when you next see him. He's a new grandfather, and he assures me that Carson Robert is the most beautiful baby who has ever been born. But it really is a great pleasure of mine to be here. And I thank you especially for giving up your break time and kind of coming in on short notice to hear me talk, and I appreciate Bumper bringing me on. That my topic, Saving the Republic, Resisting the Imperial Temptation, comes out of my thought in terms of what really is the theme of this conference. What unites the talks that you have heard and which you will continue to hear through tomorrow morning. And I think what comes out of that to me is that the Republic itself is in danger. That my guess is that within this room there's an awful lot that would divide us. We would probably have some interesting arguments, both with speakers and members of the audience, over abortion, over the role of the Libertarian Party, educational choice, vouchers. I could imagine arguments over taxes, affirmative action. I mean, any number of issues one can imagine. Even people of goodwill who share many views were going to come to enormous disagreements. But I also think that we're united by something very fundamental and very important. And to my mind, what we see today, and I think what we all fear, is an assault on the very foundation of our republic. The kind of public policies that we see today go far beyond any particular policies that we normally argue about and go much deeper to the very fundamentals of our system. And this surely is a republic that is worth preserving and protecting. For all the faults of our people and of our leaders, I'd argue that over the years, the United States of America has offered a vision. It has, at best of times at least, been a shining city upon a hill. It has been a model. It is something, a nation, an opportunity, a vision that has inspired imitators around the world. It's a country that's encouraged freedom fighters, genuine freedom fighters, in other nations. It's a nation and its people have helped liberate people around the globe. And it's filled, certainly, with warm-hearted, generous people, people who are willing to sacrifice, people who are willing to give, people who will give up their lives to help others, people who will serve, people who care deeply about their community around them and people beyond their own shores. And this is certainly something to be proud of. And I think of moments that kind of encapsulate America and moments that kind of bring out the best of our society. And there are an awful lot of those. And we think of heroes, and I think Daniel Ellsberg, a very powerful call to ask people to sacrifice when they see that sacrifices must be done. And I think over the years and throughout our history, some of the visions, some of the people, and I think, for example, of a Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. I mean, the notion that, a political people should be free, that the tradition and other things should not stand in the way, should not prevent us from having our liberty. You think of the Declaration of Independence, signed by many people who did suffer greatly. I mean, that wonderful document that we hold these truths to be self-evident. And we can look back on that and appreciate the rhetoric, But the people at the time who signed it understood that they were signing a treasonous document. They were people who faced hanging, whether separately or together. They are people who would suffer greatly if their cause failed. These are heroic people, and that document and that vision, that rhetoric has gone around the world and has animated people and convinced people, helped people understand the importance of liberty. I think of George Washington, where, whether or not one wants to call him our greatest president, he certainly deserves appreciation by libertarians for stepping back from political power. That a man who, frankly, many people would have been happy to have made a king, certainly would have been happy to have taken a third term in office, that there is something very important about the ability to step away from political power. Because if we look at the politicians we have today, who can imagine, would Bill Clinton have turned down the opportunity to have a third term in office, or a fourth term, or a fifth term? Would George W. Bush, would so many of these others? So there is someone early in our history who I think set a very important principle to us, that in fact, imbued with the most political power in your society, you can step away from it. I think of Henry David Thoreau, that didn't want to be involved and didn't want to support, didn't want to fund a war of aggression against our southern neighbor. I think of William Lloyd Garrison. I will be heard, he said. It didn't matter if mobs showed up to his rallies. It didn't matter if people destroyed his printing press. This is a man who would inveigh against, the abomination of slavery. He would demand liberty for all of America's people, and not just some based on their skin color. I think of the anti-imperialists of the late 1800s, Charles Sumner and many others, who fought against America's odious war in the Philippines, where we managed, in the name of democracy or something, to kill 200,000 or more people. And these are people who stood against the tide, at a time where the tide was rising for an imperial America. America had to have saltwater imperialism at that point. We had to have, provinces, and we had to have possessions in East Asia, the markets of China. All of this was suddenly very important and very attractive to many, many people. I think of William Jennings Bryan, and of course many of these people, we can have some very fundamental disagreements with on other issues, but William Jennings Bryan resigning as Secretary of State as he sees Woodrow Wilson is going to take us into this horrendous, awful war in Europe. The most grotesque of wars, which set the stage, of course, for the worst human conflict and carnage we've ever seen in World War II. I think of Robert La Follette, who on the Senate floor opposed World War I and was enormously abused, called a traitor, called many of the things that people today are called when they oppose the war. But he stood fast and was vindicated after that war was over. I think of Harry Weinberger. Last night, Joseph Margulis mentioned in passing, and I don't know if many of you know of it, Molly Steimer, who was prosecuted by the Woodrow Wilson administration, the great liberal administration, because she had thrown leaflets out opposing America's intervention against Russia, a nation which notably we had not declared war against, and she was sentenced to prison and ultimately deported. Harry Weinberger was an American lawyer who took up the radicals' cause. He was no communist, he was no socialist, but he was horrified at the assault on the Bill of Rights, horrified that people would go to jail for speaking their minds, speaking on political issues and matters of great public concern. And there are a lot of heroes out there. I think of Robert Taft, a man who, after World War II ends, stands up and criticizes the Nuremberg trials, not because he had anything good to say about the Nazis, but his concern about ex post facto justice, his concern about victor's justice, his concern about taking a judicial process and turning it into politics. And this is a man who had presidential ambitions. Despite having presidential ambitions, he was willing to take on about as unpopular a cause as one can matter. Think of Dwight Eisenhower, who's been mentioned. This is a man who was determined to get us out of the Korean War, and he kept us out of the Indochina War. A man, I think, again, somewhat the mold, perhaps, of George Washington, a military man, a man of some simplicity, perhaps, but he understood basic principles. Someone, perhaps the last president we've had, who understood that the power to declare war is a congressional power, not a presidential power, where he said quite explicitly, if we need to go to war, I'm going to go to Congress. That Congress is where that power lies. I think of Rosa Parks, a simple gesture, no longer will I stay on the back of the bus. I don't care what that state law is, it's an unjust law. Or Martin Luther King, who will lead a peaceful protest against the kind of horrors, you figure 40 years ago, many of our citizens oppressed by government policy. I think of Daniel Ellsberg, a great sacrifice telling us the truth, willing to come forward, willing to risk tens of years or 100 years or more in jail.